The prison guard mocked the inmate who fixed everything, until he walked out with a degree and a business. "Don't let him fool you," Officer Grant Dooley said, loud enough for the visiting state officials to hear clearly. "He's not an electrician. He's an inmate playing dress-up in a jumpsuit. He'll be back here within a year of getting out. They always come back." Emmett Sharpe stood at the open panel box in the East Wing corridor, multimeter still in hand, having just finished explaining to the visiting delegation exactly what had caused the recurring breaker trip that the facility's outside contractor had failed to diagnose twice, walking them through the fault trace with the same patient clarity he used with every student Louise sent his way. The delegation, 4 state officials in business casual who'd clearly never spent much time inside a working correctional facility, shifted uncomfortably at Dooley's comment, glancing at each other the way people glance at each other when someone has said something they wish had gone unsaid in front of them. Professor Louise Tran, standing among the visitors in her state college blazer, watched Emmett's face carefully. It didn't change. He'd had 4 years of practice not letting it change. "Thank you for the demonstration, Mr. Sharpe," she said, stepping past Dooley's comment as though it hadn't been made at all, her voice carrying just enough authority to redirect the delegation's attention back to the panel box and the technical explanation Emmett had just walked them through. One of the officials, a woman reviewing program budgets for the state legislature, made a note in her folder before moving on. Though whether the note was about the panel repair or about the officer's comment, Emmett had no way of knowing and told himself, that evening, that it didn't matter either way. 3 years later, a truck with Sharpe Electrical Services stenciled across both doors would pull into a parking lot 4 miles from that same facility, and Grant Dooley would be standing in it, waiting to find out who the state had actually contracted to fix the very panel he was standing in front of. But that afternoon, Emmett just closed the panel box, gathered his tools, and walked back to his cell block without another word. Emmett Sharpe had been at Cresthaven Correctional Facility for 8 years of a 12-year sentence, convicted at 22 for his role in an armed robbery that had gone wrong in almost every way a bad decision can go wrong. Nobody seriously hurt, but real terror caused, real harm done to people who hadn't deserved any of it, and a felony record that followed him into a cell block the same year his father's medical bills had finally quietly bankrupted the family Emmett had been trying, badly and illegally, to help. His father had been diagnosed with kidney failure 2 years before the robbery, dialysis 3 times a week, medical bills accumulating faster than Emmett's warehouse job could cover even with every overtime shift he could pick up. He'd told himself at 22 that the plan was temporary. 1 job, enough cash to cover the transplant waitlist cost the insurance wouldn't touch, and then he'd walk away from it entirely. He hadn't accounted for how badly a bad plan could go, or how completely one decision could unravel a life he'd been trying, in his own confused and desperate way, to protect. He didn't tell his story looking for sympathy. He told it, when he told it at all, as a fact he'd stopped trying to soften. He'd done something genuinely wrong. He'd hurt people who trusted a convenience store to be a safe place at 10 at night. He'd spent the first 2 years of his sentence mostly angry, at the system, at his own choices, at a version of himself he didn't recognize anymore, and didn't particularly want to. The anger had burned itself out slowly, the way it does for some men and never does for others. Somewhere around year 3, a broken light fixture in the education wing had needed fixing, and Emmett, who'd worked odd electrical jobs with his uncle as a teenager before everything fell apart, had fixed it without being asked, mostly because watching something stay broken bothered him more than most things did. The facility's maintenance staff noticed. Word moved the way word moves inside a place with very little else to talk about. Within a year, Emmett was the person cell block officers quietly called when something electrical acted up, long before they called the outside contractor the state actually paid for the work. Professor Louise Tran ran the Cresthaven College Partnership Program, a state-funded initiative that allowed incarcerated students to earn accredited college credit through coursework taught inside the facility, part of a broader push across the state's corrections system to reduce the odds that men left the same way they'd arrived. She'd taken the position 8 years earlier after a decade teaching at the community college's main campus, drawn to the work by a brother of her own who'd spent 4 years incarcerated in his 20s, and had come out the other side with nothing waiting for him but the same neighborhood and the same limited options that had led him in. He'd cycled back within 2 years, and Louise had spent a long time afterward believing there had to be a version of the system that gave men something more solid to hold on to than good intentions alone. The partnership program was, in her own private accounting, an attempt to build that solid thing, one student at a time. She'd met Emmett in her second year running the program, when he'd signed up for an introductory electrical theory course that most of her students treated as an easy credit, and Emmett treated like the only thing keeping him tethered to a future he still half believed he didn't deserve. "You already know most of this," Louise told him after the second class, reviewing his diagnostic work on a wiring problem she'd assigned as a group exercise. "Where did you learn to trace a fault this cleanly?" "My uncle. Before all this." Emmett didn't elaborate further, and Louise, 6 years into running programs inside facilities like this one, had learned not to push where a man wasn't ready to be pushed. "Well, you're wasting your time in an introductory course," she said instead. "I'm going to talk to the program office about getting you into the advanced electrical technology track. It's a full associate's degree if you complete it. 2 more years of coursework, on top of what you've already got." 2 years is nothing, Emmett said. "I've got 4 left on my sentence either way. Might as well spend them building something instead of just serving them." Officer Grant Dooley had worked at Cresthaven for 19 years, long enough to have watched hundreds of men come through the program Louise Tran ran, and long enough to have developed a settled, unshakable belief that most of them were performing rehabilitation for the parole board rather than actually experiencing it. He'd seen men complete degrees and return within 18 months. He'd seen the system get played by inmates who understood exactly which boxes needed checking to look good on paper. He'd started the job at 26, young and idealistic in ways he rarely admitted to anyone anymore, genuinely believing then that the facility could function as a place of correction rather than simply containment. 19 years of watching the same cycles repeat had worn that belief down to something considerably harder and more defended, a kind of professional cynicism he'd come to treat as realism rather than as the wound it actually was. What Dooley hadn't fully reckoned with was the difference between a man performing change and a man who'd actually changed, because from where he stood, watching a rotating cast of inmates for 19 years, the two could look identical from a distance. He'd taken a particular dislike to Emmett specifically, not for any single dramatic reason, but because Emmett's quiet competence unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. Emmett didn't perform contrition the way some inmates did, loud and theatrical for whichever audience happened to be watching. He just did the work, fixed what needed fixing, and went back to his cell without commentary. And something about that steadiness read to Dooley as an act more elaborate than the obvious performances he was used to seeing through. He wrote Emmett up twice that year for minor infractions other officers would have let slide: a shirt not properly tucked during a surprise inspection, a 5-minute delay returning from the education wing that Emmett explained, accurately, had been caused by a jammed door lock in the same corridor Dooley patrolled. Neither write-up amounted to much on its own. Together they sat in Emmett's file exactly where Dooley intended them to sit, visible to whoever eventually reviewed it for parole. By year 7, Emmett had finished his associate's coursework in everything but a final capstone project, and had started, without any formal role or title, teaching basic electrical safety to younger inmates in the evening program hours. Men who'd arrived with nothing and would leave, Emmett hoped, with at least one skill nobody could take back from them. Malik Reyes was 19 when he arrived at Cresthaven. Scared the way 19-year-olds get scared when the full weight of a long sentence has just become real to them for the first time. Emmett found him in the education wing 3 weeks in, staring at a basic circuits textbook without absorbing a word of it. "You're not reading that," Emmett said, sitting down across from him. "You're just holding it." "Same thing at this point," Malik said. "Doesn't matter what I learn in here. Nobody's hiring somebody like me when I get out." "I said the same thing at year 2, Emmett said. "Turned out to be wrong, or at least wrong enough. Come find me tomorrow evening. I'll walk you through the actual material instead of you staring at it feeling sorry for yourself." Malik came the next evening, and most evenings after that, and by the time Emmett's own parole hearing approached, Malik could trace a basic circuit fault faster than half the men who'd been in the program twice as long as he had. "You did that," Louise told Emmett once, watching Malik work through a diagnostic exercise unassisted. "Nobody assigned you to mentor him. You just did it because it needed doing." "Man needed somebody in his corner," Emmett said. "I had one, eventually. Wasn't going to let him go without the same thing." The state official's visit that produced Dooley's comment in the corridor had been scheduled for months. A review of the college partnership program's outcomes across 3 facilities. Part of a legislative push to expand funding for similar programs statewide. Louise had specifically requested Emmett demonstrate his electrical diagnostic work, both because his skill was genuinely impressive, and because she'd hoped, quietly, that a positive impression on visiting officials might carry some informal weight when his parole hearing came around in a few months. Dooley's comment had landed exactly where it would do the most damage, in front of the exact people whose good opinion might have mattered most. Louise didn't confront him about it directly in front of the delegation. She waited until the tour moved on, then found a moment alone with him near the stairwell. "That was unnecessary, Grant." "It was accurate," Dooley said. "You people bring these officials through, show them the success stories, and act surprised 6 months later when half of them are back in county lockup. I've been doing this 19 years. I've seen how it ends." "You've seen how it ends for some of them," Louise said. "You haven't seen how it ends for Emmett yet, because he isn't out yet. I'd ask you to hold your certainty until you actually have the facts to support it." "I'll hold my certainty exactly as long as I want to," Dooley said, and walked off before she could say anything further. Emmett's parole hearing was scheduled for the following spring, and he spent the months leading up to it doing what he'd been doing for 5 years by then. Showing up, doing the work, finishing the coursework that would complete his degree regardless of what the parole board decided. Louise submitted a formal letter of support ahead of the hearing, detailing his academic record, his informal mentorship of younger inmates, and his role maintaining critical facility infrastructure that the contracted maintenance company had repeatedly failed to service reliably. She was careful in the letter to address the 2 write-ups in his file directly, rather than hoping the board would overlook them. Both citations involved conduct that, on close examination, reflects either a minor dress code technicality or a documented facility maintenance delay outside Mr. Sharpe's control, she wrote. "Neither reflects a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the substantial record of growth documented elsewhere in this file." The parole board reviewed the file 3 weeks later, in a hearing room considerably less dramatic than the ones Emmett had imagined during his early years of the sentence. A folding table, 4 board members, a stack of paperwork thicker than anything else in the room, fluorescent lights humming overhead in a way that reminded him, faintly, of every electrical fixture he'd ever diagnosed. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say for weeks beforehand, not scripted exactly, but turned over enough times in his mind that the words came out steady rather than rehearsed sounding. The difference between a man performing readiness and a man who'd actually arrived at it. Mr. Sharpe, the board chair said, an older woman named Patricia Hendricks who'd sat on the board for over a decade and had heard, by her own estimate, several thousand versions of this exact conversation. "Walk us through what you intend to do if released." "Finish my degree," Emmett said. "I'm 1 capstone project away from an associate's in electrical technology. Then I want to start my own business. Residential and small commercial electrical work. I've got 8 years of hands-on experience. Most licensing programs would take considerably longer to build. And I've got a mentor in Professor Tran who's already agreed to help me navigate the licensing requirements once I'm out. That's an ambitious plan, another board member said. We hear ambitious plans in this room fairly often. What makes yours different from the others? Emmett considered the question honestly before answering. Nothing, probably, on paper. Plans all sound similar when you're sitting where I'm sitting. Because everybody in this chair wants the same thing, whether they're going to follow through or not. The difference isn't in the plan. It's in 8 years of a maintenance log with my initials on it, and a degree I actually finished instead of just started. And a professor who'll tell you directly, if you ask her, whether she thinks I'm performing or whether she thinks I mean it. And the 2 disciplinary citations in your file. The shirt was untucked for maybe 90 seconds during a surprise inspection I wasn't given warning for, Emmett said. The delay was a jammed door lock in a corridor I didn't have keys to. I'm not going to pretend either one was some kind of grave violation, because they weren't, and I'm not going to pretend I don't understand why they're in my file either. I've spent 8 years learning the difference between the mistakes that matter and the ones that don't. I'd like the chance to prove that outside these walls instead of just inside them. Patricia Hendricks studied him for a long moment, the particular careful attention of someone who'd learned, over a decade of these hearings, exactly what a genuine answer sounded like compared to a well-practiced one. We'll take a brief recess to review the full file, she said. Thank you, Mr. Sharpe. The board granted parole 2 weeks later. Emmett's release date fell on a Tuesday in March, 5 months before his capstone project was due, which meant he'd be finishing his degree from the outside, coordinating remotely with Louise's program office to complete the final requirements. Malik found him in the education wing the evening before his release, the same room where they'd started 3 years earlier. Feels strange, Malik said. You've been the one steady thing in here since I arrived. Now you're just leaving. That's the whole point of the sentence, Malik. It's not supposed to be permanent. Mine's got 6 more years on it. 6 years is a long time and also not as long as it feels right now, Emmett said. You keep at the coursework. You keep mentoring the guys coming up under you, the same way I did for you. When you get out, you call me. I mean that. Sharpe Electrical Services is going to need employees who actually know what they're doing. And I'd rather hire somebody I trained myself than take a chance on somebody I don't know. You already picked a business name. Picked it in year 4, Emmett said. Wrote it in the back of one of my textbooks. Figured naming it made it feel more real than just thinking about it. Malik was quiet for a moment. Thank you, for all of it. The circuits, the mentoring, all of it. Don't thank me yet, Emmett said. Thank me in 6 years. When you're the one walking out. That's when it'll actually mean something. Emmett's mother, Barbara, was waiting in the parking lot the morning he walked out, standing beside a car considerably older than the 8 years since she'd last driven him anywhere, having kept it running herself with a manual she'd bought secondhand and a persistence Emmett recognized as exactly where he'd gotten his own. She'd visited every month for 8 years, without fail, a 4-hour round trip she'd made in every kind of weather, sitting across from her son in a visitation room that never once felt like enough space for everything either of them wanted to say. She'd sold her late husband's tools the year after his death, unable to look at them anymore, and had regretted it the moment she learned Emmett was studying electrical work, wishing she'd kept even one wrench to hand him on this exact morning. You look older, she said, hugging him longer than either of them had planned for, her hands gripping the back of his jacket the way they had when he was small enough for her to actually lift off the ground. I am older, Emmett said. 8 years older, to be specific. You look like your father, when he was young, before everything. She held him at arm's length for a moment, studying his face the way mothers do after long absences, checking for damage that might not show on the surface. You ready for this? I've had 8 years to get ready. Emmett said. Doesn't mean I'm not nervous, just means I've had time to think it through properly. Your father would have been proud of what you built in there, Barbara said. The degree, the mentoring, all of it. I know he would have. I think about that a lot, Emmett said. Whether he'd have understood, or whether he'd just have been disappointed, I ended up here at all. Both things can be true, Barbara said. They usually are, with the people who love us most. Louise Tran had arranged, through a contact at a regional licensing board, an expedited pathway for Emmett to sit for his journeyman electrician's exam within his first month out, using his prison coursework and documented hands-on hours as qualifying experience under a program specifically designed to help formerly incarcerated tradespeople re-enter licensed fields. He passed the exam on his first attempt, 6 weeks after his release, the same week he submitted his final capstone project remotely and received formal confirmation that his associate's degree in electrical technology would be conferred that spring. He filed the paperwork for Sharpe Electrical Services the following month, working out of a single borrowed van before he could afford his own truck, taking small residential jobs at first, outlet repairs, panel inspections, the unglamorous bread-and-butter work that built a reputation one satisfied customer at a time. 2 years in, Sharpe Electrical Services had grown to 4 employees. 2 of them men Emmett had personally mentored through the Cresthaven program. Hired the same week they walked out the same gate he had. He'd kept a promise he'd made to himself in year 6 of his sentence, that if the business ever succeeded, it would succeed as a place that gave other men the same chance he'd been given, not as a charity, but as a genuine hiring pipeline built on real, documented skill. The first employee, a quiet man named Curtis who'd served 9 years for a nonviolent drug offense, had shown up at Emmett's shop the week of his own release with nothing but a duffel bag and the phone number Emmett had given him 2 years earlier. Emmett had hired him on the spot, the same way he'd later hire Malik, understanding better than almost anyone how hard it was to find an employer willing to look past a record, rather than only ever seeing it. You built something that actually works, Curtis told him. 6 months into the job, watching Emmett close out a service call with a satisfied customer. Most guys talk about giving back. You actually built the machine that does it. Wasn't trying to build a machine, Emmett said. Just trying to build a company that hired the people other companies wouldn't look at twice. Turns out those are usually the hardest working people you'll ever find, once somebody actually gives them the chance. The state's Department of Corrections put its regional facilities maintenance contract up for competitive rebid that same year, a routine procurement cycle that happened every 3 years, open to any licensed contractor willing to submit a bid. Sharpe Electrical Services submitted one among a dozen competitors. Emmett's bid distinguished by a level of specific, detailed familiarity with the exact aging electrical infrastructure most bidders had only reviewed from blueprints. His bid included a line, near the bottom, that Louise Tran noticed when she reviewed the public procurement filing out of curiosity. 8 years of direct hands-on experience with the facility's specific electrical systems, developed while completing an associate's degree through the Cresthaven College Partnership Program. Sharpe Electrical Services won the 3-year contract. Emmett's first day servicing Cresthaven under the new contract fell on a gray Tuesday morning, his truck pulling into the same visitor lot where his mother had once waited for him. Sharpe Electrical Services, stenciled clean and legible across both doors. Grant Dooley was on gate duty that morning, checking contractor credentials the way he'd checked them for 19 years, and looked up from the clipboard to find Emmett Sharpe standing on the other side of the window, in work clothes rather than a state-issued jumpsuit, holding a state contractor badge instead of an inmate ID. Neither man said anything for a long moment. "Sharpe," Dooley finally said. "Officer Dooley," Emmett said, his tone even, neither warm nor hostile, simply matter-of-fact. "I'm here for the East Wing panel inspection. Same panel from a few years back, actually, if the maintenance logs are accurate. You're the contractor now. I'm the contractor now, Emmett said. Won the bid same as anyone else would have, on the numbers and the experience. Nobody handed me anything. I'd like access to the East Wing whenever you've got a moment to process it. Dooley looked at him for another long moment, something working behind his expression that Emmett couldn't fully read and didn't particularly need to. Didn't expect this, Dooley finally said. Most people don't, Emmett said. That's usually the whole problem with only seeing somebody at their worst moment and deciding that's the whole of who they are. I'm not here to relitigate anything you said a few years back, Officer Dooley. I'm here to fix a panel. If you'll process my badge, I'd like to get started. Dooley processed the badge without further comment, buzzing him through the gate the same way he'd buzzed through 100 contractors before him, and Emmett walked the same corridors he'd walked as an inmate, toolbox in hand, toward the same panel box where a mocking comment had once landed exactly where it was meant to land. Dooley sat in the gatehouse for a while after that, watching the monitor feed of Emmett working in the East Wing, saying little to the officer who relieved him at the end of his shift beyond a brief, unelaborated comment. Sharpe's back, running his own company now. Won the state contract clean. He didn't offer an opinion beyond that. Didn't reverse 19 years of hardened certainty in a single afternoon, and didn't need to. Some men change their minds all at once. Others simply carry a small, unresolved weight forward with them. Neither fully examined nor fully dismissed, and Dooley, walking to his car that evening, carried his without saying much more about it to anyone. Louise Tran heard about the contract win from a colleague in the procurement office and drove out to the facility that same week, catching Emmett on a break between panel inspections, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with a sandwich he'd packed himself that morning. "I heard," she said, sitting down beside him. "Contractor badge instead of an inmate ID. I don't think I've ever seen that particular reversal happen quite this cleanly before." "Wasn't trying to make a statement," Emmett said. "Just submitted the best bid I could put together. Turned out my specific experience with this exact building was worth something on paper, which I hadn't fully planned for when I was fixing that panel 8 years ago out of boredom and stubbornness." Dooley say anything? "Not much. Processed my badge. Let me through." I think that's about as much acknowledgement as I'm going to get from him. And honestly, I don't need more than that. I didn't come back here for him. I came back here because the state put out a contract and my company had the best bid for it. How does it feel, being back, in this capacity? Emmett thought about that for a moment, looking out at the same yard he'd walked 1,000 laps around over 8 years. The same fence line, the same gray sky that had felt, for most of a decade, like the entire boundary of his world. "Feels like proof," he finally said. "Not proof for Dooley. Proof for myself, mostly. I spent a lot of years in here wondering if the person I was building toward was real, or just something I was telling myself to survive the sentence. Turns out he was real. Just took the contract paperwork to make it official." Malik Reyes was released 4 years later, 6 years exactly from the day Emmett had walked out the same gate, and called Sharpe Electrical Services the same week, exactly as promised. Emmett drove out to pick him up personally, parking in the same visitor lot where his own mother had once waited for him, standing beside his truck instead of a borrowed van. Sharpe Electrical Services the same week, exactly as promised. Stenciled clean across both doors. Malik walked out into the morning light looking exactly the way Emmett remembered feeling on his own release day. Unsteady in a world that had kept moving without him, carrying a single duffel bag that contained everything he owned. "You actually came," Malik said, stopping a few feet from the truck. "I half thought I dreamed that conversation in the education wing." "I don't make promises I don't keep," Emmett said. "Get in. First day of work starts whenever you're ready. But I figured you might want a day to breathe first." "No," Malik said. "I want to start today. I've had 6 years to think about starting today." Emmett hired him on the spot. No interview necessary beyond the one that had already happened years earlier in an education wing classroom, watching a scared 19-year-old learn to trace his first circuit fault. "Feels strange being on this side of the gate," Malik said, His first morning on the job, standing in the company's small warehouse loading a truck with supplies for the day's jobs. Feels normal, eventually, Emmett said, handing him a company polo with Sharpe Electrical Services stitched over the chest. The same clean stitching Emmett had once worn into a wedding of a family friend, into a licensing exam, into every ordinary Tuesday of the life he'd built one panel box at a time. Give it a few years. You'll stop noticing which side of any gate you're standing on. You'll just be a man doing good work, which is all any of us really are, underneath everything else people decide to call us. Malik pulled the polo on, checked himself briefly in the truck's side mirror, adjusting the collar the way a man adjusts something he's still getting used to wearing, and climbed into the passenger seat beside the man who'd once told him, in a room neither of them would ever fully leave behind, that 6 years was a long time and also not as long as it felt. He'd been right about both.